Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the All in Crypto podcast. I am your host, All in Crypto, and today I am delighted and excited to be joined by Nick from Ajuna Network to talk to us about Web3 gaming, to talk to us about gaming in general, and how Polkadot is tackling all of this. So, how are you, Nick?
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty well. Quite a busy time, especially for, I would say, both the gaming and sort of the blockchain space. So yeah, exciting things coming up.
Yeah, and I love to see the further application of the blockchain space. You know, it's not just Bitcoin, and that's the only thing that a distributed ledger is good for. It's very interesting, and I don't suppose you've got any kind of thoughts on this to add, that blockchains, distributed ledgers find themselves at the kind of forefront of many industries, not just money and an alternative store of value. And gaming, I think, is an amazing example of all this.
Yeah, I mean, since once we sort of got past the first protocol, which was sort of Bitcoin, or the first application was sort of digital money, then the industry started opening up. Sort of, we started having smart contracts. Then we started getting into much more both complicated and more powerful systems that are being introduced, each year now that we pass in the blockchain space. But at the heart of it all, what we're trying, at least when we're trying to sort of talk about gaming and sort of the blockchain space, or Web3 gaming, as sort of is the I would say the term that tries to encompass everything, is how can we make sure that all of this digital world that we're moving into, which has digital assets, that we can figure out ways that we can assign sort of proper value, that we can make sure that we can deal with true digital ownership, and sort of leave this current Web2 status, where I think one of the biggest problems that has emerged in Web2 is that the internet was never really built with an economic model or financial model inside it. And as a result, now that we're at the peak, let's say, of Web2, where everything works, everything is seamless, we have become the product and our data has become the commodity. And that's sort of a really troubling space to be in. And what I think sort of the vision, at least from my side, that blockchain can offer is how can we, by putting this economic model into this sort of social graph, how we can sort of take back ownership of our own digital lives and expand sort of forward. So it's a very interesting time and a very interesting technology. And yeah, that's sort of, I would sort of frame right now how the two spaces work together, or how they should be building towards the future.
Yeah, it is fascinating. You know, there's a real kind of unlock, I guess, for the world that seems like it started with Bitcoin. I know some people will say that, you know, it goes further back than that, and there was papers that were published. But it seems like there's an unlock for humanities. We're kind of leveling up almost with this distributed ledger thing. And it is just, you know, it's truly fascinating to be positioned where both me and you are, and kind of watching all this unfold. So with all my guests, I really like to start with a little bit about themselves, you know, a kind of a more of an introduction into yourself and kind of how you stumbled upon this industry.
Yep. So I was born and raised in Greece. I came from a family of which was very much involved in the financial sector. Back then, I was told, I have to go to a good university so I can make a career out myself. Did my best. Ended up studying both for my bachelor's and my master's in the UK, and sort of my first work experiences were there in the sort of the big corporate world, in banking and also pharma, which I always found as an industry quite fascinating. And then returned back to Greece. I had to do my military service, which is still mandatory in Greece. Got into the financial sector just about when everything went to shit in Greece. And suddenly I found myself with too many degrees in a country that I couldn't get paid. So at that point, I was just married, moved to Switzerland. And that's where, this is over a decade now ago. And that's where my entrepreneurial journey, let's say, started. My first company was... you could call it a Netflix for fitness. So trying to figure out how we could take this YouTube now led fitness era that had started about 10 years ago, combine it with metrics from all of these smartwatches and try to make it into sort of a social type of thing. Very interesting first experience for me in the consumer facing project. And later on, back in, I think in 2017, where I first, I would say, deep dived into the blockchain and gaming space back then, trying to create our own layer one, our own Polkadot, if you want, where we're trying sort of to address how can we get high throughput with low friction, because that sort of seemed kind of the big problem that we were seeing in the blockchain space. So we built essential infrastructure where we tried to be building on Solidity, which was sort of the programming language for the Ethereum ecosystem, but we were using a consensus algorithm, which was, I think it was first introduced by EOS, which could make things a lot faster. We thought it was a great idea. We'll be able to be attractive to both communities. And that's where sort of we figured out that, you know, the blockchain space at large is still quite tribal. So instead of attracting both communities, we ended up being hated by both communities. But the real problem there is that setting up your own, let's say, layer one was something which is very expensive. It's very difficult to secure, and you were always sort of open to attacks, which meant that simply maintaining the infrastructure was uneconomical for most projects getting into the space. And that's where close to 2021, I met up with Cedric. Cedric is a software solution architect. He had worked in the banking sort of sector of Switzerland, but on his part-time, he was always making and breaking things from the Bitcoin protocol itself, where the first thing that he did, I think this is back in 2015, maybe a bit earlier, he actually took the Satoshi part of the transaction and sort of encoded logic and created a lottery on the Bitcoin protocol, which was obviously highly illegal, and he'd never sort of launched, but that's the way that he was sort of trying to interact and see how infrastructure blockchain can be used to even support full game engines. Wow. And that's where he had started experimenting with this, at the time, new ecosystem, new paradigm, which was sort of substrate and pallets instead of smart contracts in the Polkadot ecosystem. And the value proposition that was sort of given back then, that, hey, look, you can launch your own layer one with sovereign layer one without having really to care for the trust and the security, because it is provided by Polkadot, which we can consider as a layer zero. And that was a fantastic value proposition, and that's sort of, we deep dived into that space. And since then, yes, I'm sort of building, trying to build up with teams the right infrastructure, the right type of relationships in order to onboard gaming into Web3, which is quite difficult to do overall. So that's a bit about my background.
Yeah, I believe difficult indeed is probably an understatement. But it's fascinating. There seems to be a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space that have come from a financial background. And maybe, and I always said this, when I started to learn about kind of finance and markets and things like this, I really kind of started to understand how the world works. And I think that is the kind of right pickings for people that would be interested in crypto. You know, you understand the kind of corrupt nature of things, and crypto makes a lot of sense to, I think, financial people that see the inner workings of things, you know?
Yeah, it is fascinating, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of studies for this in the future. But essentially, it was an industry which started with the stock exchange, where everything suddenly was listed. It had a price, and you could trade it. So naturally, I think it either attracted, whether it's the right type or wrong type of investment folks or from the financial industry, that's very true, and it's still to a very large sort of extent being guided or being driven by that stock exchange sort of price, which can be at times obviously very problematic, but at the same time, it's, I think, the biggest reason why it has managed to get to these sizes over the past sort of decade or so.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people. There's a few camps in crypto. We know how tribal it is. You've got the people that are dead against any kind of speculation, and people that do that, and it's very tribal. And I think we need to. I think it was one of the Hedera founders that actually said we're kind of fighting for scraps at the moment. Mm-hmm. You know, let's work together as an industry and get it to where it needs to be, get those billions of users, and then we can start dividing it amongst ourselves rather than fighting, you know, at this kind of early stage. And I do think crypto is still at an early stage, but I love how you kind of came to Polkadot through trying to facilitate a layer one, and then actually realizing that Polkadot offers this, but offers what is often the most complex part of all this, which is the kind of consensus. And through launching on Polkadot, you kind of already have billions of dollars of security.
Yes.
Was that the real attraction there?
Absolutely. So it was twofold. It was that the first sort of evaluation that we had to do is the technology itself. Is it sort of robust enough? Is it scalable enough? And obviously there the answers for us were pretty clear in terms of being yes. First of all, you had the founding team of Polkadot is sort of the team that was behind Ethereum itself. Gavin Wood is, if not the single author, he's one of the authors of Solidity, so the programming language. So there was a team there that you could trust, really sort of trust, not even trust, sort of there was truth there, right? They had built all of these things and you could see them. And at the end of the day, even Gavin Wood himself said that sort of Ethereum was always an experiment, right? Never sort of intended to become what it is back then, what it has become now. So essentially for Gavin and the team, Polkadot is the evolution, or was sort of the evolution of what sort of Ethereum should be. And I think that's sort of quite common that you have seen over the past couple of years that other ecosystems have, I'm not going to say copied, but taken quite a lot of the good things that Polkadot has implemented and tried to apply them into their own ecosystem. So the technical part was definitely the first thing that we wanted to evaluate. The second was exactly what you said, that having your own sovereign network and for it being secured, the fact that, as you said, there's billions of dollars and massive teams behind this sort of securing this was a headache that most of us were very happy to have sort of off the top of our head.
Yeah, there's so much that makes sense about Polkadot. Not only looking at where it kind of came from and the intention behind it to kind of maybe right some of Ethereum's wrongs or whatever it may be. And the interesting thing with where the space is kind of going now is, I think you're absolutely spot on. People, I would say, have definitely taken influence from Polkadot in the sense that we've gone away with, or we've done away with this kind of, let's just do everything on the layer one, because it's just not scalable. And now you see everybody kind of paralyzing their, whether it's transactions, moving it onto layer twos, or you see a very similar approach. Even Ethereum's roadmap, there was a lot of similarities between kind of where Polkadot already currently is today and the direction Ethereum's going in. So amazing foresight by Gavin Wood. I mean, you know, it just seems right. It just seems everything about it from an interoperability point of view to a scalability point of view. And that's the beautiful thing about Polkadot. As it grows, the capabilities of it grow. Everybody within the ecosystem grows. It's a blockchain that just deserves to be showcased, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. There's problems, right? And most of the problems that the ecosystem has are sort of fairly acknowledged. And the good thing is that we have quite a passionate community which is trying to solve them. But yes, I think the foundation of everything has to do with a very high technical competence and a solution which can be hopefully infinitely scalable, right? Sort of in the future.
Yeah, yeah. And let's move on to gaming, because really where I'd like to start, some people might be new to this idea of Web3 gaming and kind of what it brings to the table. And that's really where I'd like to start, is by kind of explaining what this idea of Web3 gaming is. Are we even using the right terminology there? You know, how would you define the introduction of gaming with a distributed ledger? You know, what is that?
That's a good question. Maybe I'll start with why gaming, as sort of, at least for blockchain. I think one of the very interesting things about the gaming industry at large is that it manages to do two things at the same time. It manages to take the very latest technology tech has to offer and bundle it in a way that is abstracted from the end user. So as today, when we play a game, which we'll call it Web2, it was never called the Web2 game. It's called the Web2 because we came up with something that's called Web3, but I'll get to that. We play a traditional game. I'm not gonna try and sell you a game. Hey, try to play this game because it's running on Amazon Web Services and it's written in Xcode. That's not a pitch for a game. I'll tell you, hey, play this game because it's fun, or hey, go there, press the link and play it. Now, what gaming has done for ecosystems is that when a new technology is being introduced, let's take the mobile phone for an example, the smartphone. So Apple introduces the smartphone, and maybe a year or two later is where they introduce the App Store, which sort of changed everything in terms of how we perceive these smartphones. The biggest vertical, not only back then, but to date, on the app stores are games. The biggest vertical within gaming itself, so people, when they think about gaming, they think about PlayStation and Xbox and PC games. Mobile gaming is the biggest sort of size chunk of this whole industry. How was this sort of, I think, accomplished? Now, the problem that initially the technology was facing is that we were used to gaming being on sort of on a big screen or sort of having a dedicated device. So most game developers, what they would do in the beginning, they said, okay, this looks like an interesting new device, which is in the hands of every people, so of every person. And let me take what I've built elsewhere and port it, so just throw it onto a phone. So the initial iterations of these games made no sense on a mobile. Not necessarily because the screen was small, but because the business model was not there. We were used to paying for games good money. We'd pay $30 to buy a game, $40 to buy a game. It was something physical. We would put it in our console and play. Now, when you think about sort of app stores and the evolution of app stores, we got conditioned in having free apps or paying $199, $299, and $99 for things and still complaining. We were holding an $1,000 phone, but complaining for the $299. But that was the sort of the reality of it. So the gaming industry was sort of stuck in a, okay, this is a device that I need to be on, but I haven't figured out the business model that makes sense. At some point during those first couple of years of, let's say, gaming on app stores on the mobile devices, there was that sort of click moment, that magic moment. You can call it the Candy Crush, you can call it something like that, where somebody figures out, hey, let's try this freemium model where I can onboard en masse people because it's free and they like free, especially on phones. And then let's introduce other payment mechanics. Obviously, these end up being abused. These end up creating some sort of really nasty type of situations. But the reality is it gave a second life to gaming. Gaming could have been dead as an industry if it were not for more mobile games. So that was kind of a long-winded introduction of sort of gaming. But where does blockchain come in? So the evolution of this freemium model created this paradigm that we are in right now, that we are paying money and we own nothing. It's super convenient, right? I can have my Xbox Game Pass. I pay $10.99 a month. I have a massive catalog of games. If I stop paying, I have nothing. All of these digital in-game items, which people pay good money, and not only pay good money, they're passionate about, they care about them, they mean something to them. At an instance, they can be taken away from a developer or sort of a game. So these type of, I would say, initially emotional reactions, which then lead to thinking about from a financial point of view, is where the blockchain space comes in. So gaming currently doesn't need blockchain at this stage. I think in the future it will. Blockchain does need gaming 100%. And the reason I think that it needs it is twofold. We need to onboard en masse users onto sort of these networks so they can start using them and figuring out all of the other sort of wonderful things that can be done. And I think the second reason why we definitely need gaming is because these digital economies that have been created in games over the past decades, where we are used to the idea of a digital asset and exchanging V-Bucks gold, is what a lot of the sort of the why the infrastructure of what blockchain as an infrastructure can sort of build towards. We're talking about digital ownership and all of these types of things. And gamers are sort of the right first adopters or recipients of this information because they're used to. The difference that we're trying to tell them now is that what if you actually own these things? So that's where sort of I see blockchain space, the blockchain sort of space in general, playing a very active role in the next evolution of gaming or the next evolution of the business model of games.
Yeah, and I want to extend on that. I want to talk about how actually with a blockchain, you can enhance gaming kind of period. We've touched on a few things there. Before I do that, I want to kind of throw an interesting thought out in regards to this idea of GameFi and the digital world that we're moving towards. Now, I am a believer that, and we're seeing the rise of AI. AI is going to be very similar to the agricultural revolution, except for this time, I'm not quite sure what people go on to from that. And the issue that I see arising, unfortunately, I do have some of Yuval Harari's books behind me. Not the biggest fan of the individual, but I think, you know, he's somebody that's informed. And he speaks about this world where we end up with useless human beings. I don't know if you're familiar
Yes.
with that. Now, he was asked, well, what do you do with these useless human beings? And I think that's an awful way to I don't think any human beings are particularly useless. He was asked, and he said there's two things that I think we can do. And one of the answers that he gave was gaming, and the other one was pharmaceuticals. You come from the pharmaceutical industry itself. We're getting somewhere here. I promise, guys. We're not just taking you all around the Recon to get nowhere. And the interesting thing with gaming is I actually think in a world where the economic model is totally different because of the likes of AI and the replacement of the labor market, something like GameFi and an economy based around perhaps gaming doesn't seem that far stretched to me. If you see where I'm going with this, it doesn't seem, it seems like the world that we're moving towards, it's going to be very different in regards to what the economic model is. And is there a role for gaming in that new model? I think there is for people that maybe get displaced because it's entertainment and there's derivatives that can be derived from that. Do you see where I'm going with this? I think it's an interesting thought that I've often thought when it comes to gaming and kind of Web3. And in that case, in that world, gaming now needs blockchain because otherwise it's entirely controlled, manipulated, and we end up with the same problem that Bitcoin tried to address with central banking. Can you see where I'm going with this? What do you think, Nick?
Maybe an approach that I'd like sort of, because gaming, when we try to sort of confuse gaming with sort of philosophy, it can get quite messy. Maybe I'll try. One thing that for me is quite clear is that these digital worlds that we are entering, right? It started the first digital world that most of us entered, or our first metaverse, right? Because that's another fancy term that we keep throwing around. That entered, at least for me, that I was born back in 1980. The first metaverse was the internet itself, right? Because suddenly what the offer of that metaverse was that I can connect with anyone from across the world, and I can get access to information from around the world simply from my computer. So that was sort of the first iteration of what a metaverse meant for us. Because up to that point, my reach was where my car could drive me or to sort of the next library. Now, as the decade sort of passed, we see that we spend more and more time inhabiting these digital worlds, and they start having an increasingly bigger value to us. And when you take that into gaming, a good example is sort of World of Warcraft. It was simply a massive sort of game. People could go in, get sort of entertained. They end up spending a massive amount of their time in those sort of worlds. So if they had X amount of time allocated for entertainment from something which was sort of playing outside, watching a bit TV, and maybe there was a small portion of gaming, this sort of has shifted to the majority of the time being gaming. And the second thing that they realized is that a lot of these items were so valuable to them that they would actually create black markets or gold farms in order to be able to get these things. So once we are getting to this point where our digital representation has real value to us, then unless we can find ways to secure and assign value to all of these items in a good way, the whole thing sort of breaks up. And that's where I see the future, where, as you said, that for gaming to thrive, or for any digital economy or digital identity, we need to figure out economics which work for that and which we own, and we are not the product that we currently are. It feels like we're literally going onto online spaces, and we are renting out from our personality, our data, to sort of our everything, which we should not be doing. So I still think, I mean, I know from the technologist point of view, you could always say that, look, what's the biggest problem? You can create the perfect system, right? From a tech point of view, from a code point of view, and always the problem is going to be the human in control of it. But again, the assumption is that there's always going to be a human in control of all of these things. I don't see humans as something which is eventually useless, or sort of things like that. And that's why probably the current state of affairs is one of the most interesting that we've had for a few generations, because we have these three massive, I would say, technologies, or we have this convergence of Web3, AI, and UCG, so user-generated content, where it's going to create explosive new industries. And I couldn't find a more interesting time to be sort of alive and working in this space.
I always get asked that question. If you could go back in time to anywhere, where would you go? And I always say right here, you know?
Yeah. It's the other, I mean, the other moment in time that I would put, which is quite similar, is the .com. Is exactly sort of when the beginning of the internet. It was the same pitch, right? Let's decentralize information. Let's decentralize ownership. Let's remove middlemen. And at that point, you had sort of this asymmetry of information in the beginning of it, where the technologists or the people building there had all of the information. Investors had no idea, right? An investor could not differentiate between Amazon.com and Nick.com. And that was sort of the why the bubble burst. Quite similar with sort of how the first cycles of our blockchain space were. There was a huge asymmetry of information. Investors knew they needed to be into it. They couldn't do their proper due diligence. And so they sort of like, let's just push and see what happens. And each cycle you get better, you learn better, investors get more informed, developers or sort of builders get better at what they're doing. And hopefully you get to differentiate quite fast between sort of, okay, this is a big opportunity, an Amazon or a pet.com or nick.com. So it's either the .com or exactly where I am today in terms of where I would like to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's truly fascinating. And actually, there's a crossover, you know, distributed ledgers. When you talk about things like AI, they can solve a lot of the problems that AI has. You know, we saw that Gemini issues. I mean, I was in an EE store, which is like a mobile phone network provider slash contractor. I'm sure you're familiar with them. And there was this thing called the Samson AI. And I said to the guy, I said, what's the AI element in this? And he couldn't tell me. And it's like similar-esque to everyone just putting .com at the end of their name. But there is actually something really genuine here. And blockchain really does find itself at the convergence of many things. And to kind of move on from that and to bring things back to where we were, what are some of the benefits that you think a distributed ledger brings to gaming? Ownership, of course, is a big one. Maybe we could get into things like governance, the direction of the game, and how there could be voting on that. All of this kind of stuff.
Yep. So there's a lot of generally focus on what from a tech point of view can sort of a ledger do. So there's the easy stuff, right? In terms of explaining them. Yes, digital ownership is very important, and I think it will become a standard rather than an exception down the line. It just makes a lot of sense that based on the same sort of thought process that we did before, if these are supposed to be owned by me, I need to make sure that these are owned by me and not by publisher XYZ. Then a second thing that I think is where distributed ledgers become very interesting is not for their technology, is for the way that they can spring up a community and support a project. Gaming has notoriously a big problem over the past decades. It's very difficult, very expensive to make a game that will also be a financial return. So you can take the biggest VCs over the past sort of 20 years and just see the track records. You will see most of them up until a few years ago would not touch games, individual games. They may invest in a publisher. They may invest in a technology company that's building for gaming, sort of Twitchers, Discord, sort of these types of things. But there wasn't sort of an investor in Call of Duty. There was an investor in Activision, which sort of the publisher. So it's a low return bet to put sort of individually money in a game. And that's sort of for two reasons, which go back to a lot of the problems that the entertainment industry has at large. Very costly to make a game, as it is to make a movie. Very difficult of why your game, as opposed to his game, is going to be the one that's going to be successful and have the financial return. And the second really big problem with games, especially as the industry has exploded to the sizes that it has right now, it's very, very difficult to build out a community. So most games are now 100% dependent on these either big platforms or publishers, whether you want to call it Steam, you want to call it the Epic Store, you want to call it the Android Store, where they pretty much have to give, 30%, sometimes even more, of their earnings back to those publishers, which put them in a very difficult situation. And I think sort of ledgers, or not ledgers, the blockchain communities, or the way that governance, as you mentioned before, can really help these projects is to building up these communities of early supporters, which can sort of help them to develop the game. Now, there's a couple of things here that I think have been quite misinterpreted over the past few years about the role of governance or the community. So there was I think a period about a year or a year and a half where there was this impression that what we were saying as a blockchain industry is that a gamer will affect how you're developing the game, or he will make a decision whether you should sort of fix bug A, or do this, or launch the next expansion or not. That's not what we're saying. We're not trying to make the work of game developers difficult, right? A game developer should be able sort of to explore his vision and sort of bring it to market. It's more about, so open governance has right now the advantage that it can help fund these projects right out of a community. Think of it like a Kickstarter type of sort of offer that they can do. And I think in terms of other things that could be interesting for governance has to do with of how you can organize these communities around games. Each big game has a community. 90% of the people there, you can consider them passive users, gamers, just there sort of having their fun. And there's probably a small percentage which is quite passionate, let's say 5-10%. That could be pro gamers, it can be mods on their discords, it could be people making graphics, making videos, all of these things which don't get paid. Most of the times these do not earn enough money for what it is that they're doing. And I think that's where governance, where making sure that it can pay out to the people that are bringing value into these communities, is where it can really, really play a big role.
Yeah, I think there's a number of areas that you know can really be benefited with a distributed ledger, and I think governance is a massive one, certainly in regards to steering a game in a certain direction and kind of rewarding people for their participation in a game, and actually strengthening that whole community. And then there's markets that can open up on the back end of all of that. You know, you mentioned about how some items are really rare and there's a massive weight on them. I think I was speaking to somebody about a game called Fortnite. I'm sure you're familiar with it. You mentioned V-Bucks. There was a skin on Fortnite, a skin being like a costume that you wear that fetches something like $3,000 or $4,000. And people will literally sell their accounts.
Yes, because they can't sell their skin. They're forced to sell their account. That's very true. Another great example is Counter-Strike or CSGO, where there is a market for them, right? It's a wall-guarded market because it exists within Steam, and some of these items go for hundreds of thousands, sort of for players. That skin or sort of that really rare item. So there are already these economies in, and I think you're absolutely right that where these ledgers can sort of open up the market for these games is give them a second life or a second revenue stream through these marketplaces and through these digital assets, where whether they're doing it by direct sales or simply by getting indirect revenue from people trading these items between them, it's a massive potential revenue stream for them. Now, a lot of the times where things come to a head is that always in the gaming industry you have a gambling side and a gaming side. Gambling is still sort of, for a lot of people, gaming or gambling is also a massive industry. Right now, I think where a lot of the friction comes in is that it feels like we have gamblers, right, trying sort of to dictate what we should be doing with games, and which creates quite a lot of friction. Now, it usually works out best when it's the other way around. You need to have a game which will attract thousands of users, to which a whale, a gambler, or whatever, then can jump in and sort of see how they can impact or make a financial sort of gain out of it. It's not new. Whales in games have existed, since the beginning, which is the example that we gave before of World of Warcraft. It's the equivalent of whales back then were the people who were spending the 2, 3, 5,000 on items in games, which is, you know, a pretty good, the same thing happening in our crypto space. Whales started because some of them decided, hey, I am going to put 5,000 in X shitcoin, which I have no idea what it is, when the rest of us normies, let's say, would never do it because we were sort of there for the, I don't know, just to figure out what's going on or play it safe.
Yeah, there's entire new revenue streams that actually open up. I know with some NFTs or certainly platforms, they impose royalties. So if you think about a game like Fortnite, they sell that skin, that's the sale done, that's it. Whereas actually they could take a whole new lease of life in regards to the secondary market and actually create entirely new revenue streams. So you could really see the benefits from both perspectives, from a blockchain perspective with gaming, from a gaming perspective with blockchain. And this is going to bring us on beautifully to Polkadot. Because Polkadot really, I always say this, I think Polkadot has probably the richest ecosystem pretty much in the entire crypto space. It has everything. All your financial stuff, your DeFi stuff. DePIN is now becoming really popular on Polkadot. You also have a hell of a lot going on with gaming and kind of Web3 gaming. And I want to explore some of that with you. So you are the perfect man to be asking about all this. What do you see happening right now on Polkadot as it relates to kind of Web3 gaming? What are some of the really things that you find interesting, cool, and that you kind of want to share with us?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's one of the main reasons that I chose to build on Polkadot. I will start where the problems that we need to solve from our ecosystem. We have, as you said, all of the right infrastructure, the right pieces, but currently we don't have a good way of either onboarding users to this technology or projects. So even right now, if I would sort of blindly ask a game developer, hey, go check out what the offering for gaming is for Polkadot, he would not find sort of a single place that he can go and figure out, okay, what is on offer here? What is the technology stack? What is the community that I can get part of? How can I get access to funds, grants, and things like that? So we have a massive problem, I would say, of it's not a UX per se or sort of a UX UI type of issue. We haven't created those storefronts in order to be able to attract people. And a big sort of part of my role, especially moving forward, is how can we take all of this beautiful sort of technology under the vertical of gaming and put it into the hands of game developers and creators out there. Currently, we have a lot of interesting things coming up. So there's currently in the ecosystem, there's 2 upcoming, let's say, blockchains or projects which are dedicated to the gaming vertical. Obviously, there's Mythical Games, which was, I would say, it started probably as a traditional studio. It's one of the better funded projects in the space from, I think, investors all the way from A16 in their first initial round, and sort of their last round was essentially, I would say, the Polkadot round, which was their decision to actually choose to launch their ecosystem onto Polkadot. That's a big thing. And the big thing is because Mythical brings something very specific here. They bring sort of that traditional, let's call it Web2 game sense, where they are trying to make sure that they completely remove the friction that currently exists with wallets and blockchain from the end user, but at the same time, making sure that it is there in the background, it is securing their assets, and it will be accessible to each user every time. So just to give a small example, with their game NFL Rivals, which was sort of obviously a massive IP with the NFL itself, it launched, was super successful on iOS. Still, I think if you see the transactions, on-chain transactions of Mythical chain with their sort of NFTs compared to even Ethereum and Solana, it's always there in the top 3, top 4 over the past few months. And this is with a single game. Competing against sort of these blockchains. Now, what they spent months trying to make sure is how can we ensure that we're going to be compliant with all of these different platforms, whether that's called mobile stores or the Epic sort of store, or that, so our games can be launched and people can find them. The way that it works is that each new sort of user that signs up in the traditional ways, it's an email or anything like that, a wallet is sort of automatically created in the background. And so once you're into the game, if you get into the game and you like it and you enjoy it and sort of you have these assets which you care about, then you essentially get triggered that, hey, by the way, you actually own them. And let me put you through the hurdles of wallets and all of these things. But I think what's wonderful there is that essentially it seems that Mythical is not so much caring about onboarding to Web3. They're interested in offboarding to Web3, which I think is a brilliant strategy. We don't need people to care about the blockchain. We don't need them to care about wallet. We need them to care about the assets. When they care about the assets, whatever hurdle I put in front of you, you will sort of go through it. Then on the other hand, we have sort of projects like Ajuna Network, which is one of the projects that I co-founded, where we were always interested on the on-chain part. So how can we take this technology, which right now is kind of slow, kind of difficult for most people, and see how much can we push it? Can we put game engines on chain? Can we create serverless games? So this type of more experimental indie almost sort of approach, what it does is that it builds towards a future where we can potentially massively reduce operational costs or server sort of costs for running a game. We can create situations where you don't even probably need funding, right? Because if you can launch sort of your own on-chain game with your NFTs or whatever they're going to be called at that point, digital game assets that you can sell, you could become sort of a self-funded sort of project all alone. So there's these different approaches, different technologies within our ecosystem, which I think are going to be super interesting for game developers. So essentially, our job from now on is make sure that we can present to the world Polkadot as a ready-to-build ecosystem, which can onboard new games and new projects.
Yeah, in a seamless way. I think it's really important. Not everybody that drives a car is a mechanic.
No, it's exactly. And maybe one of the things that I like about Polkadot, or sort of the vision for Polkadot, you'll hear a lot of blockchains projects, shouting that we're here to onboard the next billion users. Polkadot is, if that was a metric, we're pretty bad at it, right? In terms of onboarding users. I think Polkadot's sort of vision, or generally sort of because of this emergence or this convergence of these three technologies of sort of AI, Web3, and as I mentioned before, user-generated content, we are trying to, a user in the future is not going to be a user, he's going to be a builder, because all of us will be able to build our own things. So Polkadot's goal is essentially to onboard the next billion builders, and that probably doesn't apply to me or even my generation, probably applies to my kid, right? Which when the time comes up, he's probably not going to be buying a skin in Fortnite. He's probably going to be making a skin in Fortnite, right? So I think that's sort of the vision towards we're trying to get with Polkadot, and it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, again, it goes back into that kind of segue that we went into in regards to the future and what is the economic model of the future, and is gaming and all of this stuff a part of it, and I think it is going to be. And yes. The beautiful thing I think with Polkadot is there's so many places to build with Polkadot. It's not just like you just build on Polkadot. You've got all these layer ones that you can build on. You only need one or two of those. You only need one or two games on Polkadot, like you had mentioned with the NFL game, to do really well. And then you've got your millions of users that are now actually in the broader ecosystem, perhaps without even realizing they're in it. And this is the beautiful thing about, when I look at the internet, what actually made the internet wasn't the facilitators necessarily of the infrastructure. It was the content creators. It was the Facebook, the whatever it may be. And I don't think blockchain's any different. I think people need to really understand just how important getting people to build on this technology actually is. And how would you say Polkadot kind of tackles that in regards to gaming?
I think that's a great but gaming should be, at least at this early stage of this technology, nothing more than the entry point into these networks. It's, as you mentioned, my first or anybody's first interaction with the internet was something, right? It could have been that the first thing that I was interested to see was Amazon or whatever it was. But eventually, once I'm on it, then I get the opportunity to figure out, okay, what else is in there, and I'll discover other things. Same thing that when somebody jumps, because you made that example of creators, which I think is great. The first time usually that somebody will jump on YouTube is quite specific. I want to see, Premier League highlights. And probably then the next couple of days, I'll keep doing the same thing because I'm like, oh, shit, this is awesome. I can sort of see whatever highlight I want. By day 30, you're probably watching cooking, and that's just at best. You're watching sort of cooking lessons on it from an influencer. So again, it's the entry point, which I think is super important. And that's where, at least from my side, the focus on this gaming vertical is really, really important. Make sure that we can create that entry point into this ecosystem, because then once you're in, there are beautiful things to discover, right? Whether that's called DeFi, whether that's called DePIN, as you said. So there's a number of different things in this ecosystem that already sort of are currently being built, which we need to get eyeballs onto them. And in the same way as gaming has done for, as I said, for the mobile phone, for other devices in the past, it creates a sort of super easy entry point into the ecosystem. The second thing that, and that's sort of more a philosophical thing, as I said, I'll try to avoid them, but I do genuinely believe that the next, big companies, the Apples, the Facebooks of the future, will have the DNA of a gaming company, because to run a successful gaming company, you need to have both the most talented and creative people alongside the most technically competent people in order to create something sort of magical. And it's not by accident that NVIDIA is one of the biggest companies right now in the world, or probably will be the biggest. And their focus was, they started on gaming. I wanted to create graphic cards to be able to sort of to facilitate gaming. Now that business model, evolved, and suddenly we had Bitcoin miners hijacking cards and creating this first big explosion for NVIDIA or graphics cards. And within years, suddenly there's a second explosion where, oh shit, actually these graphic cards are what are going to power this AI revolution. So I truly philosophically believe that the DNA of future companies is that of a gaming company.
Yeah, no, again, going back to, if you think about where we are as a world and where we're heading, it makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting parallel that you draw there between NVIDIA, because I didn't quite understand NVIDIA until I saw it moving in terms of price. And then I was like, hang on, what's going on here? And then you go, Sam Altman this is a lot more recent, obviously, the narrative. But what made sense for me was Sam Altman came out and said, we need $7 trillion for chips.
Yes.
i.e. GPUs. And it's like, well, hang on, NVIDIA's and you do have blockchain equivalents of that. And actually all of this stuff is very relevant in regards to gaming and kind of spawned from it. And I think that's an interesting take that you've got there in regards to gaming being the next big company. And when you think about an economy, when you think about a community, when you think about, look at Bitcoin, for example, look at what's around that now. And really it started off with, here's a network and here's how you can partake in it and you can get rewarded for doing so. Gaming is that narrative.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I think it's generally a good fit for this industry, more so from the way that it can ramp up and incentivize communities. And obviously there's the technical sort of obviously part to it. Amazon Web Services was not interesting because, hey, this is an awesome technology stack that I can, put my assets on from a game developer. It was that, oh shit, this thing can open a new thing called multiplayer, which basically means, or live services, which suddenly connects us all, whether that's within a game or sort of something like that. So yeah, I think that's a very valid argument. And maybe that's why, going back sort of briefly to Polkadot, why it offers a number of different entry points, even from game developers. As I said, you're going to find projects in there which are going to be really focused on sort of these on-chain games and on-chain economies, like Ajuna. You're going to find companies like Mythical, which you can see sort of like the big publisher, sort of on-chain publisher coming up. Then there's EVM solutions like sort of Moonbeam. There's projects that are sort of only building around pallets. There's different things. We need to figure out ways just to make this sort of digestible, at least again, sort of on the gaming vertical, where the offering towards game developers in the support that they will get is clear of how they can sort of build out their sort of projects inside this ecosystem.
So if I'm gonna, and this is going to be a really hard question to answer, I think certainly I would find it if I was being asked it hard to answer. How long do you think all this is going to take? Now that's almost impossible to say it's going to happen on this exact day at this exact time or in a few years or whatever it may be. But what do you think the kind of, not only how long is this going to take, do you think, but what kind of a road from where we are today do you think needs to be followed? And what do you think the kind of time scale of that is? And I suppose maybe I should define what that is to this point where actually people are playing Fortnite perhaps, and they don't even realize that there's a Web3 element to that where actually they can own their skins, and you've got all these kind of markets upon markets and integrations going on that, are just normal. Like we use the internet today. We don't think about the towers and the storage and, what does that look like?
So I think from a gaming perspective vertical, we're probably about 5 to 10 years, I would say, out from as you said, that moment where it's so massively adopted that I don't even realize it. Because I believe although the technology is there, right now, there's the right sort of elements in the blockchain space, there are the right elements in the creator space or sort of game development space. What to me seems to be missing, that we need to get to that magic moment where somebody figures out the business model that makes sense. It's a business model thing which will sort of automatically make, as we said before, the freemium model, which suddenly make 100% sense for the technology and the device at that time. We need to get that to that moment. Still at this stage, we're quite off, I would say, because we have an industry in the blockchain space which is currently just throwing terms towards game developers, NFTs, on-chain. These things don't mean anything, right? Sort of a non-fungible token is not a value proposition on its own. We need to get to the point that they figure out that magic way to make this technology simply work. Another big fallacy that's going on for quite some years, I think, but it's getting better. At some point, maybe a year or two ago, we were getting into this, each game has its own token, which sounded great from our space because we're like, oh, it's a token, so I can invest. So it makes it easier for crypto VCs, it makes it easier for crypto retail. But if you think about it, there's a problem, there's a structural problem there, that a game is supposed to have, in the majority of times, and I mean over 99%, a beginning and an end. A token economy is not supposed to have an end, right? Because then eventually somebody is left with the zero back. So how this sort of thing that every game would have its own token, I think is slowly sort of going away, and we're getting into much more economic models, even with the use of tokens that just make sense. We just always have to think back that a game will end. What happens to an economy which has a token, right, when that game ends? So I think moving now towards this, we're seeing tokens from studios, which is something that makes a lot more sense, right? A studio can start with one IP, build on that IP. If it's successful, they can move on to the next thing, and that sort of token flows throughout the economy. So we're looking at more sustainable uses of this technology rather than the ones that we're currently seeing, which still seem very opportunistic. I think the past couple of years, there was this wrong impression that it was the crypto market scamming the game market. It was quite the opposite, if I had to be honest. They weren't scamming us, but the game developers figured out, oh, they have no idea. All of those crypto bros, I'm saying it in sort of a more fun way here, is that they figured out, hey, crypto bros know nothing about game development. All I have to do is just throw an interesting slide and put a kick-ass video out there, and I can raise money. And yeah, the gaming industry raised probably the most money they raised over the past 20 years in 22 and 23, most of it fueled by the good intention of our industry to figure out ways to support them. And I think it's great that we did that, because the gaming industry is in massive need of funding. It's in a really sort of tough spot right now. especially indie game developers. And that's where we should be focused on how we can get all of these creators to be able to live in these economies and make, these beautiful experiences that they can do.
Yeah, it's exciting. And I think something that's really exciting is the opportunity that is now being given to those indie game developers. If you look at the kind of mammoths in the gaming sector, they don't really innovate. They kind of move quite slow. It's kind of like Apple, for example. Like Call of Duty is a great example. Not to hate on Call of Duty any way, shape, or form. It was a game that I've spent many, many hours on. I'm sure most of us have.
Yeah.
But the new iterations of the game are just very much the same game, just with some difference. And I'm sure there's a lot more technically that goes into that.
It's the example you said with the FIFAs and the NBAs that, after the fifth FIFA you've bought, you're realizing, why do I keep spending $7, or why does EA keep doing it? And the answer is pretty easy from EA's point of view. It sells, it's easy. I have a license and I'm going to keep pushing it down your throats. Now, eventually, all of these things, as you said, they get to the point where when you feel that you're being exploited, you're probably being exploited. And
I'm very much a free market guy for all my sins. And I think or certainly with the implementation of a blockchain and this new way to kind of self-sustain a game, this is actually helping the gaming space as a whole, because what you're going to do is introduce competition that hopefully is going to force innovation from the kind of mammoths, or at least challenge them to the point where they can get overthrown. And we see a new paradigm and a new kind of competition. And this is going to enhance everything. This is the beautiful thing, I think, about blockchain in general. We had at one point the central bank, and then Bitcoin said, here's an alternative. As far as a store of value goes, I don't think it would make a viable money, even with Lightning, to be quite honest. But that's for an entirely different video. You don't just have that occurring in the kind of monetary sense. Gaming, beautiful example, and everything that we have just spoken about. And I'm sure people that are watching this are going to be absolutely fascinated in regards to where they can actually learn more about all this, where they can go and find you and kind of follow along with what's happening within the Polkadot ecosystem and how Polkadot is specifically tackling gaming.
Yeah. I mean, for Polkadot itself, I would encourage everyone, you can visit polkadotplay.org. That's sort of the centralized hub we're creating for the gaming vertical. There you will be able to find information about both the technology and the community sort of building it, and the different parachains and teams in this vertical. You will also be able to see the different funding opportunities that are out there in our ecosystem. Currently, there's game bounties, there's treasuries, there's funds which are sort of supporting the ecosystem, ready to financially support games or projects that want to launch into our ecosystem. I would also encourage you to follow the Polkadot Twitter account. It's sort of, especially over the past couple of months, it's becoming quite active in sort of sharing information about what's going on gaming for us. And I think as an external source, I would always advise somebody to go be part of, I'll call them gaming DAOs or gaming initiatives. One of them is the Blockchain Game Alliance. That's sort of an initiative which combines both big industry players like Ubisoft and protocols like Polkadot itself, and many, many others, where sort of there's a common goal of spreading information about sort of Web3 gaming. Another one is the Game 7 DAO. These sort of more neutral, I would say, sources are super useful and have always been super useful for me too.
Yeah, we're going to leave links to all of that in the description. This has been nothing short of fascinating for me, and I'm sure my audiences really appreciate you coming on, Nick, and sort of sharing your knowledge about sort of gaming, what's going on, how distributed ledgers are going to play a role in all this, and how Polkadot is kind of tackling this, and what we can look forward to moving forwards, and how this whole industry is kind of innovating an already existing industry. And I think that last point that we touched on in regards to actually distributed ledgers potentially through the self-funding mechanism are optimizing the space as a whole and creating that competition that's only going to benefit users, not to mention the ownership and the governance and all of the other kind of stuff that gets packed onto it. So the last thing for me to do, Nick, is really say thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and I'm really hoping we can do this again sometime.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope your audience sort of enjoyed this brief insight into gaming on Polkadot. Hopefully, we will have more to share, not only as a network itself, but hopefully gaming and in this space will have quite a lot more to show in the upcoming years. So thank you again for having me.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thank you very much. That's all from us, folks. Thanks a lot for watching.